Should America have entered World War I? Many have tried to answer this question, and their conclusion seems to be no. Generally speaking, these writers thought America should have stayed neutral, which would have resulted in the Central Powers' victory over the Entente. This outcome, they allege, would have prevented the Nazis, World War II, and the Holocaust. Some even went as far as to suggest it would also prevent the Soviet Union and Stalin. But are they right? Is this the most plausible outcome if America sat out the Great War? Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian. So, can you win a world war without America on your side? Well, the answer might surprise you. Now, this is normally where I put things into their proper historical context, but just to be clear, I'm not going to summarize all of World War I. If you're the type of person who watches alternate history videos, you probably have a general idea on what that was all about. But if you want to know more, I do recommend checking out the Great War channel. Although their scope has expanded and their leadership changed, they covered the conflict in real time for the year centennial back in 2014. So go check them out. Additionally, one of the sources they relied on was The First World War, A Complete History by Martin Gilbert, which I also found useful and can recommend as a good overview of the war. But I will discuss World War I from America's perspective. Now, when the war broke out in 1914, America tried to stay neutral, but they were pretty pro-Entente. American culture was heavily influenced by the Entente nations, especially Britain, and also Americans viewed Germany as an autocratic, militaristic state that was at odds with American concepts of democracy and freedom. Plus, atrocities committed by the German soldiers in occupied Belgium did not endear Germany to your average American. Still, most Americans wanted to stay out of the war, and President Woodrow Wilson campaigned in his re-election to do just that. But this did not prevent the U.S. from trading with Britain and France. In fact, the demand for American goods and loans meant that a lot of Americans were making money by contributing to the Entente war effort. However, American neutrality would eventually end. You see, the British blockade of Germany had been extremely effective in denying food and war materials, like oil, to them. In order to give the Brits a taste of their own medicine, German U-boats were ordered to attack British shipping in the Atlantic in a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare that saw the deaths of some Americans, such as when the RMS Lusitania was sunk in 1915. For a brief period following American protests, Germany did halt this campaign, but in 1917 they returned to it, hoping it would knock Britain out of the war, even at the risk of bringing America into the conflict. This strategy of unrestricted submarine warfare, coupled with suspected sabotage by German agents and the publication of the Zimmermann Telegram, which had Germany promise Mexico the return of territory lost during the Mexican-American War should they join the Central Powers, finally led to President Woodrow Wilson requesting Congress to declare war on Germany on April 2, 1917. Still, the Germans were right that it would take time for America to gather, organize, equip, train, and transport an entire army across the Atlantic. This was no easy task, and is part of the reason why American soldiers only spent roughly 6 months in direct combat in World War I. Nevertheless, those few months of fighting were arguably crucial in ending the stalemate on the Western Front and bringing about the ultimate defeat of Germany. More importantly, though, it gave America a seat at the peace talks and meant they could influence its outcome until the U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles. So now we have to figure out how to keep American doughboys from going over there. Well, I mentioned Germany's strategy of unrestricted submarine warfare, but they weren't the only nation at the time hindering American shipping. As I mentioned, the UK was blockading Germany, and thus American ships were often seized by the Royal Navy if suspected of carrying contraband to Germany, and would have to wait weeks or months in British ports. Meanwhile, American protests were often ignored by the British. Still, as far as I can tell, all of these disputes were eventually resolved with no loss of life. But what if one of these incidents went south and ended with some Americans dead? This could be seized upon by the anti-war faction that was present during this period. Although perhaps forgotten today, there was a diverse community of people opposed to America's entry into the Great War. They were made up of Democrats, Republicans, and Socialists like Eugene Debs and A. Philip Randolph. Various Christian denominations, women's rights activists, and poor rural Americans also made up a large portion of the anti-war movement. German and Irish Americans opposed the war, the Germans for obvious reasons, and the Irish still remember the role of the British in the Great Famine. Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire also didn't care much for the Tsar and his ilk for carrying out the pogroms that drove them to America in the first place. Now, in our timeline, all of these groups were unable to convince America to stay out of the war, but in this alternate timeline, being able to argue that the actions of the British made them no better than the Germans could invigorate the anti-war movement and cause interest in intervening in the war on the side of the Entente to plummet. Thus, Wilson might keep his promise to stay out of the war. So, America stays neutral, which begs the question, does this change the outcome of World War I? Well, I've read a few counterfactuals that attempt to answer this very question. For example, historian Ross Kennedy believed that without American involvement, Germany would have won, especially given the mutinies the French army was facing near the end of the war and the difficulties the Entente governments were starting to have in getting loans from American banks. Additionally, articles that I read by John J. Tierney Jr., Thomas Fleming, Jim Powell, and Michael Kazin seem to agree that without American intervention, the Entente would not be able to defeat Germany on their own, and thus they would either lose the war or would have to agree to a negotiated settlement. Even the people behind the popular Hearts of Iron mod, Kaiserreich, also have Germany winning the war if the United States sits it out. So yeah, the consensus seems to be that if the Entente is going to win the war, they need American troops. But what if you don't need America to win a world war? First, let's acknowledge the fact that Americans were probably too pro-Entente to practice real neutrality, much like Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, desperately wanted to do in our timeline. But unfortunately for Bryan, financially the war was good for America, as it helped American industry and the financial sector grow thanks to the huge demand for American goods and loans from the Entente. So even with the crisis I brought up in my point of divergence, you probably still see war materials and loans heading toward the Entente, since no one wanted to inadvertently crash the economy by suddenly deciding to be fully neutral. And if I'm being even more honest, well, American money and materials were probably a lot more helpful to the Entente war effort than soldiers. Indeed, neither the Entente nor America itself expected them to have an effective army until 1919, and of course we know the war ended before then. This was in part due to the time necessary to get the American army up to speed on modern warfare, but also because the commander of the American army, General John Pershing, insisted that American units would not just be reinforcements for British and French divisions, and instead wanted to wait until they could be used as part of a united American army. Sure, some American divisions were reluctantly sent to the front by Pershing, and American troops at Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood proved effective at holding the Germans back. However, the consensus among the rest of the Entente was that while the presence of American soldiers did boost the morale of British and French troops, they and their officers were nevertheless unprepared for the realities of modern war, and were usually uninterested in learning them from actual veterans of it. This meant that American units sometimes suffered unnecessarily high casualties as their commanders made the same mistakes Entente generals did early in the war. As British Field Marshal Douglas Haig put it in October of 1918, the American army was, and I quote, "not yet organized, not yet formed, and has suffered a great deal on account of its ignorance of modern warfare." Of course, if this is true, then the question we need to ask ourselves next is, why didn't Germany win the war in spite of American reinforcements? Well, the truth of the matter is that things weren't going well for Germany by the end of the war. As mentioned, the British blockade was extremely effective at cutting them off from the rest of the world. Germany could not properly feed its soldiers, and people in the cities were starving and sometimes resorted to eating dogs and cats. Germany's attempt to give Britain the same treatment, i.e. their campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, failed largely due to the British adoption of the convoy system in 1917, which proved effective in stemming the losses of shipping. All this meant was that the German people were not happy. There were strikes, riots, and acts of mutiny by German soldiers and sailors. Even Polish soldiers who defected to Germany from Russia mutinied when asked to swear loyalty to the Kaiser. And things weren't much better among Germany's allies. Austria-Hungary was experiencing protests and nationalist uprising, and losing soldiers who defected to the Entente armies, such as Czech and Slovak troops who made up the Czechoslovak Legion in Russia. By the end of the war, it was wholly dependent on German military support to keep them in it. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was losing ground to the British and their Arab rebel allies, despite German support. Bulgaria was also dealing with mutinies in their own army that forced them to cancel offensives along the Salonika front, and along with Austria-Hungary, was sending out peace proposals to the Entente. Granted, the October Revolution in Russia did breathe fresh hope into the German war effort, since it freed up many divisions from the Eastern Front who could be transferred west. Now in our timeline, Germany moved these divisions as quickly as they could to France to use in the Great Spring Offensive of 1918. aka the Kaiserschuld, in part because they wanted to deliver a knockout blow there before more American troops arrived. Now, I've seen some suggestions on social media when I first asked about this same what if, that these divisions would instead be routed to Salonika or Italy to break the stalemate there before going to France, but I'm not convinced. Look, we know from hindsight that all of that dissatisfaction I mentioned earlier was propelling Germany toward their own revolution, starting in the late 1918 and ending in 1919 with the establishment of a Republican government. But I think even the leaders of the Central Powers realized a revolution was coming if they didn't do something soon. As one Austrian negotiator at the peace talks with the new Soviet Union mused when told by a Bolshevik representative that they might one day bring the revolution to them, and I quote, "We shall hardly need any assistance in bringing revolution among ourselves. The people will manage that if the Entente persists in refusing to come to terms." And while the German victories out east did secure them access to the fertile farmlands of Ukraine, the aforementioned nationalist uprisings across Central and Eastern Europe and the Russian Civil War kicking off meant that they would be unable to hold these areas for long without ending the war out west. This means the German generals might still try for the Kaiserschuld because they needed to win the war and end the blockade as quickly as possible before their own people rose up. But they still might fail. It's important to remember that the spring offensive of 1918 happened before large numbers of American troops arrived in Europe. So the vast majority of soldiers facing the numerically superior Germans were British and French. Sure, the Germans gained a considerable amount of ground during the offensive, and even Paris was hit by long-range artillery, but the Entente soldiers were not routed. Paris did not fall, and thus the Kaiserschuld failed. But why? Well, the soldiers Germany sent from the east weren't fresh troops like those arising from America in our timeline. These were weary from years of war and already susceptible to calls for revolution. And what's worse is the Germans suffered high casualties during this offensive, which hurt their morale. Plus, the Germans lacked proper logistics to keep their advancing troops supplied. And let's not forget, Germany didn't have any friends across the ocean who could bail them out, or colonial holdings where new recruits could be drawn from. And as the war dragged on, all of these problems only became worse for Germany. And let's not forget perhaps the biggest reason why the spring offensive failed. The British and French soldiers just fought well enough to stop it. Again, in our timeline, the British and French and their other allies on the Western Front stopped the German offensive with only minimal help from the American soldiers. And I think they could still do it in this alternate timeline. I mean, we know they had the ability to wage war far longer than the Central Powers did. For one thing, the combined population of the Entente, especially when you include their colonies, was still greater by magnitudes from what Germany and their allies had. For example, Britain itself was still sending thousands of soldiers to the front, and India, Britain's largest, perhaps most important colony, provided 1 million men to the war effort. Of course, some people might bring up the mutiny in the French army from late April to early June 1917 as a reason for why the Entente was on its last legs and would be knocked out without the US. But I think people overestimate the seriousness of that mutiny. Yes, many French soldiers deserted or refused orders to attack German positions, but it was hardly a revolution, and French units continued to defend themselves from German attacks. There were very few instances of violence against officers, and after General Philippe Pétain promised leave time away from the front, better food, and relaxing of discipline, order was restored rather quickly. After all was said and done, only about 1% of the soldiers of the French army participated in the mutiny, and even smaller percentage of that received any kind of punishment. And funny enough, the Germans didn't even know it happened, so how debilitating was the mutiny for the French if their enemy, who was desperately looking for any weakness they could exploit, didn't notice it? But something the Germans probably did notice is the Entente factories were producing more and more of one new innovation of modern warfare, the tank. Of course, the Germans had some of their own, but these lumbering beasts could not match the hundreds of tanks the British and French were building. Although not always reliable, they were often successful in breaking holes in German lines, and by 1917 and 1918, the British and French had more experience in how to use them alongside infantry, artillery, and aircraft, which was something Germany struggled to counter. And, most importantly, the Entente planned to have 5,000 of them ready to breach the front lines in 1919. There were even plans to have soldiers transported by trucks in order for them to quickly take advantage of these breaches, all the while supported from the air. Although the Entente still lacked the tactics and equipment, like radio, to truly make this an effective use of mobile warfare, this blitzkrieg-like offensive would still have been an impressive force. Look, I know what I'm saying is controversial, but the Entente doesn't need to capture Berlin to win this war. They just need Germany to give up, and while it might take longer and cost more lives, I think the Entente could do it. So, if the Entente can stop the Kaiserschuld, then the exhausted and disheartened German armies would likely break down. If they are still holding out by 1919, then the Entente mechanized fist would deliver the knockout blow, and, like in our timeline, force the Kaiser to abdicate and the Germans to sue for peace. But what would this alternate Treaty of Versailles look like? Well, the Treaty of Versailles in our timeline has a reputation of being overly harsh, and I won't argue here whether that is deserved or not, but it would be even harsher in this alternate timeline without America at the table. In our timeline, American participation in the peace talks at Versailles probably helped to restrain Britain and France. For example, France initially wanted to carve the Rhineland out from Germany to act as a buffer state, but was talked out of it by American promises they would help maintain the peace and keep a future aggressive Germany in check. But without America, Britain and France would have no restraint, and that could backfire on them. Like, imagine this alternate peace treaty is more like the Treaty of Sèvres of 1920, which ended the war for the Ottoman Empire. In our timeline, it left the empire a rump state with most of Anatolia carved up into foreign zones of influence. This did not sit well with Turkish nationalists led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, and it kickstarted the Turkish War of Independence, which after the new Treaty of Lausanne of 1923 gave us the modern state of Turkey. So, if the Entente tries something similar with Germany, it would likely incite a similar outcome, with a military officer like Hindenburg or Ludendorff seizing power and refusing to recognize the treaty, thus daring Britain and France to restart the war. And they might not, actually. They too would be exhausted from it and would likely be worried about revolution if they dared order their soldiers back to the front lines. In our timeline, when the war ended, there were mutinies by the soldiers angry they weren't going home fast enough. Even if there was the political will to restart the war, the influenza epidemic could still be raging across the world at this time, and it's doubtful if the Entente would even be able to scrounge up enough healthy soldiers to take up arms. Thus, the final official peace treaty might be more acceptable to Germany since they'd have a seat at the table rather than have terms dictated to them by the Entente. Personally, I think at the very least Britain and France could require Germany to cede Alsace-Lorraine back to France, give up claims to its colonies, and pay some kind of reparation, which in our timeline Germany was willing to do at first. But I think the Entente would find it extremely difficult to prevent German unification with Austria or stop them from interfering in Eastern Europe. Although, to be honest, Germany might not be in any position at first to do much. Certainly there wouldn't be any mass intervention in the Russian Civil War to prevent the rise of the Soviet Union, but Germany might hold on to some of the German-speaking areas of Poland that went to them in our timeline. So, the war is over, but what happens next? Well, history might remember the Spanish flu as the American flu. In our timeline, the influenza pandemic of 1918 originated in Kansas, but wartime censorship covered up its existence. However, because neutral Spain was willing to talk about it, they got the blame for it. However, in this alternate timeline, neutral America would have no reason to suppress information about the flu, and thus the warring nations might blame America for the outbreak instead. Of course, this is assuming a flu pandemic still happens. In our timeline, many historians point to Camp Funston in Kansas as ground zero of the 1918 pandemic. This was a U.S. Army training camp constructed to train new recruits, but in the alternate timeline I'm suggesting, this would never be built, and thus American soldiers wouldn't become infected and spread the flu to the rest of Europe and beyond. However, as John Barry wrote in a 2004 article for the National Library of Medicine, it appears the outbreak actually began in the rural and remote region of Haskell County, Kansas. So if this theory is correct, a flu pandemic originating from America was still plausible, since even without troop transports, we know Americans were still traveling to Europe in spite of the war. As for politics, American neutrality likely means the Socialist Party of America is better off. The Socialists were opposed to intervention, seeing as a war between imperialist powers that only hurt the workers but spared the elites. However, membership in the Socialist Party dropped drastically after America entered the war. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 curtailed a lot of speech that impacted socialists. Leaders like Eugene Debs were thrown into prison, the post office refused to deliver socialist publications, and socialist labor unions, like the Industrial Workers of the World, experienced government crackdowns. Meanwhile, disputes over whether or not to support the war led to some prominent members leaving the party. Also, the Espionage Act is what Trump is indicted under. Isn't it fun when the past affects the present? However, in the timeline where the anti-war faction is victorious and America stays neutral, the socialists likely don't see such a drop in membership and perhaps even absorb frustrated progressives from the main two political parties. The socialists may even be able to better weather future crises, such as if the first Red Scare still happens in this timeline, and disputes with the more radical communist members. Thus, the socialists and the labor unions aligned with them could still be an important political force, with elected officials at all levels of government, although whether they would be even large enough to rival or replace the Democrats and or Republicans is anyone's guess. Meanwhile, American works of art and literature would be drastically different or not exist at all if America stayed out of the war. For example, would The Great Gatsby be written without Scott Fitzgerald's own experience with World War I? Even popular symbols of America might not exist, such as Uncle Sam. Although he predates the war, his use in American wartime propaganda standardized and popularized his image, making him the enduring personification of the country he is today. But in this alternate timeline, he may be more obscure or have alternate versions, and thus Lady Liberty might be a more popular symbol of America. Speaking of the ladies, women in America might not be called to the workforce in such large numbers to replace the men drafted into the army as they were in World War I. This could delay many achievements of the women's rights movement. Indeed, without labor shortages in northern factories, less African Americans would move north during the Great Migration. Meanwhile, it's important to remember black soldiers also were some of the first Americans to fight. While General Pershing held back many American soldiers until they were ready to fight as one army, he was happy to send black units to the French that he considered expendable. These regiments, like the famous Harlem Hellfighters, not only got to fight under experienced commanders who knew what trench warfare was about, but they also were treated as relative equals by the French, which is something they would not experience back home in America. Thus, both of these changes could have a major impact on the civil rights movement. We also shouldn't ignore how American intervention motivated a lot of immigrant communities to prove their loyalty to America by volunteering for the military or doing other acts of patriotism. All this led to an expedited assimilation of immigrant communities, which might not happen in this timeline. And one of the biggest beneficiaries of this change would be German Americans. They wouldn't face the intense discrimination they did in our timeline due to Germany being America's enemy, which arguably forced many German Americans to shed their ethnic heritage and quickly assimilate into the general American culture. For example, the state of Texas had a large community of Germans who spoke their own distinct dialect of the German language and taught it to their children in schools. However, following America's entry into World War I, the state changed its laws and required children to learn English in schools. Today, there are only a few thousand native speakers left, and the number is still declining. But in this alternate timeline, Texas would likely not pass any such laws, and today this community of Texas Germans would be thriving. Instead of barbecue, Texas is known for having great Wiener Schnitzel. Fashion would also be different as well. For example, beards might still be in style longer. In our timeline, American soldiers had to be clean-shaven in order to wear gas masks. After the war, this changed how people viewed facial hair, encouraging American men to regularly shave. But in a timeline where the doughboys never go over there, beards might remain in fashion for far longer. And for women, the corset might also remain in style longer. When America entered the war, the demand for metal led to the government to discourage women from buying corsets. But in this alternate timeline, there would never be such a patriotic call to buy a bra instead. And what is going on in the rest of the world? Well, that is a big topic, and it's hard to speak plausibly on it without more research, but I could see the UK and France's view on America in the post-war years grow colder. I mean, America would have sat out the war in this timeline, but they sure would like to get paid back for all those loans they gave to the Entente, which could lead to economic hardships in those countries, which then in turn would be blamed on America. In fact, if America has a stronger socialist element, many right-wingers in the UK and France might start accusing America of being too friendly with the Soviet Union, which also wouldn't be viewed in a positive light in those two countries. In fact, America in turn may reciprocate this ill will to the victorious Entente. There was certainly some concern in our timeline about a possible war with the imperialist powers of Britain and France. For example, in the early 20th century, the United States military drafted the infamous color-coded war plans, which proposed strategies in case of war with various nations, including Britain, France, and the British Dominion of Canada. Now, these plans were obviously never used, but in the decades following the end of this alternate World War I, America may need to not only update these plans, but perhaps even find an ally, no matter how peculiar of a choice they may be. And what about the Entente? Maybe they would need a new ally, especially to defend them against any threat from the East. Perhaps with growing tensions with America and concerns over the Soviet Union, they may reconsider their position on Germany. Sure, the nationalist Germany I speculate about would not be a pleasant place for many people. The leaders would likely be people who once followed the Kaiser, and may include among them people who, in our timeline, committed one of the worst genocides in human history. But if these German nationalists come down on the far right as hard as they do on the far left, it might be a state the Entente would be willing to consider becoming its newest member. Look, I'm not saying this is the most likely outcome of my what if, but like the armies of the Entente in the closing years of World War I don't think we can dismiss it completely. Anywho, should America have stayed out of World War I? Well, if the answer is no, only because staying out would create the conditions for a German victory and thus prevent the horrors of the 20th century, I don't think I can agree with that entirely. The whole argument is based on the assumption Germany would win, and in my humble opinion, that assumption is flawed given what we know about the end years of the Great War, and doesn't even consider how chaotic history could be if they still lost. Those who have considered this counterfactual in the past seem to overestimate the military capabilities of the United States and the Central Powers while underestimating that of the Entente. And while I am occasionally wrong, I do hope that, at the very least, people walk away from this video with a more nuanced view of the soldiers of the Entente and an appreciation of just how disruptive war can be to one nation's status quo. Well, that's all to say on the subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.